All right, what's going on, everyone? So last week, a major terrorist attack was carried out in Moscow that has been claimed by Islamic State Khorasan province. Now, for anybody who's been watching this channel for a while, you know that Islamic State has never been defeated. They're very much still a thing and arguably are more of a threat today than they have been at any time in the past 10 years. So I thought it would be worthwhile to run through real quick some history of the Islamic State as well as history of Islamic State Khorasan province, briefly talk through the various attacks Islamic State has carried out in recent years, and then maybe most importantly, talk about why they would want to target Russia. Now, right out the gate, I want to provide a few sources that are pretty relevant if you want to follow along with this subject matter in general. Aaron Zellin, Colin Clark, and Lucas Weber. I'll put each one of their link to each one of their Twitter accounts in the description below. These are guys who, they're subject matter experts when it comes to terrorism. They have been focusing on terrorism for a long time and are some of the key people I look to anytime there's an event like this that takes place. And the challenge here is the world moves on. Right? For the last few years, we've been so hyper-focused on Russia and Ukraine and recently Israel and Gaza that international terrorism kind of falls off the radar. But as we can see by the event that occurred in Moscow, this is very much still a significant threat. It's a global threat that impacts just about everybody around the world. Aaron, Colin, and Lucas are some great resources to check in on to get an idea of what's going on in that space. So starting out with who is Islamic State, with a brief history here. The modern day Islamic State kind of traces their origins back to 2004 during the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, where that military intervention kind of created an opportunity for Al-Qaeda, then the largest and most notable terrorist organization, to create a presence on the ground, if you will. At that point, 2004, a year, with 6 to 12 months after the invasion kicked off in Iraq, Al-Qaeda was largely on the run, right? We'd pushed them out of Afghanistan at that point. They still had global ambitions. Were kind of, bin Laden was the number one wanted person in the world. They had carried out a couple other attacks since 9/11. There were still more to come, especially in Europe. But their image, there was a concern a little bit that their image was starting to fade. But when they looked to Iraq, all of a sudden they saw an ability, the possibility, to protect Muslims in their land, to protect the Iraqi people from the invading infidel American army, right? It's a good PR move for Al-Qaeda. They had the ability to kill Americans, kill infidels on Muslim land. It's a big PR boost for Al-Qaeda to show that they're still very much relevant. Even though it's crazy now looking back to think that Al-Qaeda wanted to show that they were still relevant just 3 years after 9/11, when here we are 23 years after the 9/11 attacks. But it was on their mind, and one of the major reasons why they started to team up and create a bit of a presence inside of Iraq. So that opportunity kind of took form through something known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI. It was briefly also known as Islamic State of Iraq, and you start to see kind of a mesh of the two organizations here. The most prominent leader during this period of time, for anybody who was involved with or followed the war in Iraq, the prominent leader here was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was just infamous for his incredibly deadly bombings, mostly targeting Iraqi Shias that would result in just staggering death tolls. And in fact, it was Zarqawi's kind of approach to all of this that created a bit of a rift between Al-Qaeda in Iraq and what would eventually kind of morph and become Islamic State. Zarqawi very much believed that targeting the Shia was a focus. Starting the civil war, killing other Muslims would be a step in the right direction of eventually taking on the Americans. Al-Qaeda very much disagreed with that approach and thought that you should not. That if anything, the Shia, while they're not directly in line with what Al-Qaeda and then Islamic State believed, they were closer and not anywhere near the enemy that the Americans were and the coalition forces currently operating inside of Iraq, or even the Iraqi government that had aligned with U.S. forces. So a rift started to emerge between those two organizations that is still very present today. And we'll talk more about this later, but Al-Qaeda and Islamic State are not exactly on friendly terms. So by 2013, due to pretty increased instability in Syria, to say the least, due to the civil war there, the group morphed a bit and changed their name to what is now known today as Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or Al-Sham. You'll see a couple of these different terms thrown in there, which is where a little bit of the confusion originates. ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or Islamic State of Al-Sham. It's the same organization, right? Really what this has to do is looking at the Arabic words being used by Islamic State to describe the organization and how those are interpreted elsewhere. This might be a really bad example, but I'm going to try it anyways. If you come in the United States, depending on where you are in the country, if you order a Coke, you might get a Coke, or maybe you'll get any sort of soft drink. In other places, you might order a pop or a soda. It's all referring to the same thing. It just kind of depends which part of the country you're in for that to make sense. But the core of it is the same. That's what we're talking about here. ISIL, ISIS, same thing. If you want to use one and not the other, go for it. Neither one is right, wrong, newer, older, anything like that. So that is the core of Islamic State. It's mostly today still based out of Syria. However, they began to branch out into this variety of affiliates, franchises, if you will, all around the world. And this relationship here is still a little bit confusing, and it's hard because it doesn't line up exactly with how Al-Qaeda operated, and it doesn't line up, it's a long shot, from how we tend to operate in the West. So these affiliates took on even more of a notable role as the U.S.-led coalition began to push Islamic State back across Iraq and Syria. If you remember, starting in 2014 on or about, Islamic State took over vast amounts of terrain across Iraq and Syria, overran Iraqi army outposts, and quickly held territory. This terrorist organization held territory. The downside for Islamic State there is that made for some pretty tempting targets and a lot of targets of opportunity for the U.S. and coalition forces across Iraq and Syria. And it didn't take long when they were out in the open holding terrain for this U.S.-led coalition to kind of roll them back and kill quite a few of their local leaders in the process. So still today, when you think of Islamic State, think of the headquarters aspect sitting in Syria with a degree of cooperation, maybe is a better way to put it, with all of these affiliates, mostly throughout Africa and the Middle East, but technically all around the world. It's not a direct relationship, a direct command relationship where Islamic State Central is just giving orders, telling these various affiliates to do this, that, or the other thing. Much, much looser than that. Now, getting into ISKP, Islamic State Khorasan province. This is a group we've talked about quite a bit here on this channel. This is the group who has so far claimed responsibility for the attack in Moscow. What I'm going to leverage to kind of talk through ISKP is an article recently written by Adam Roussel on our Substack, and I'll link that in the description below as well. Adam put this together just a couple days after the attack in Moscow as kind of a primer to give people an idea of who ISKP is, because I think they kind of fly under the radar. They might be viewed as this local Afghanistan group. Why do we have to worry about what's going on in Afghanistan? Aren't we done there? When in reality, the ISKP propaganda in recent years has really focused more and more on targeting external actors, conducting attacks all around the world. So Adam says ISKP was reportedly founded in Afghanistan in 2014 by defectors from the Taliban, TTP, otherwise known as the Pakistani Taliban, and Al-Qaeda. It takes the name Khorasan from the historical region of Greater Khorasan, which comprises modern-day Afghanistan and much of Iran and Central Asia. This is a point I wanted to hit on real quick. They have not operated alongside the Taliban. You've had a variety of reasons why people would join ISKP, but by and large, ISKP looks at the Taliban as lesser. They hate the Taliban. So when you hear some of these theories about Islamic State coordinating with and kind of creating these partnerships with countries around the world, unfortunately, I've already heard the conspiracies of the United States, Israel, Ukraine, NATO, UK, you name it. They can't even get on the same page with the Taliban. They look at the Taliban and they're actively killing them every day. They've been engaged in an active war with the Taliban for 10 years now. This is not a group that gets along well with others. There is no relationship of convenience here. They do not, IS in general and ISKP as well, they do not stray from their ideology at all to achieve long-term goals. That is not an aspect of this organization. So a little bit more here on ISKP. They say, unlike other major IS movements, such as those in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Mozambique, ISKP has never held large territories. Instead, it focuses on carrying out deadly and destabilizing attacks inside Afghanistan and elsewhere, often of the heinous variety, such as the close-range shooting of women and infants at a Kabul maternity ward on May 12, 2020. They also talk about ISKP's English language magazine, The Voice of Khorasan, which is a challenge to find online. Before you go down any rabbit holes thinking you're just going to Google that, you're not. It is hidden on the internet. I've had some real challenges trying to dig that one up in the past. Fortunately, if you follow people like Aaron Zellin that I mentioned earlier, also, again, his information linked in the description below, his site, Jihadology, often links out to this and provides kind of a safe-to-read PDF version that he's downloaded from some sites that maybe aren't ideal to visit on your personal devices. But recently, the Voice of Khorasan has put out quite a few gripes against a lot of major non-Muslim powers in the world. Again, according to Adam here, they say these include U.S., Western countries, and Israel, which they label crusaders, Zionists, etc., along with China and Russia. They still label Russia communists and atheists, as well as India. However, their greatest ire is often directed at other groups and states in the Islamic world that they deem insufficiently pious. Those include, but are not limited to, Afghan Taliban and other governments of Pakistan, Iran, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkey, and others. And although ISKP is based in Afghanistan, as you can see from this list of groups that they hate and are continuing to threaten, it's a growing threat internationally. I wanted to bring it home to this real quick before we get into where they've attacked and why they would attack Russia. Islamic State is a global issue. And the United States is not going to solve a global issue on our own. We need cooperation from countries all around the world. And it's a unique threat because, as we saw from this Moscow attack, they attack enemies of the United States, right? We are not on good terms with Russia right now. Islamic State carried out an attack against Russia. However, if we want to eliminate this threat that is Islamic State or tamp it down as much as possible, it's going to require an international effort to get on the same page because Islamic State, they kind of hate everybody. So in talking about some of these external acts that Islamic State, Khorasan province has started to carry out, which is unique for Islamic State. This is kind of a new aspect. Most of these Islamic State branches are relatively local in what they're targeting, or, I'll say regional loosely, but even ISKP, some of this is regional. Just a couple months ago in Iran, January 3rd, ISKP carried out bombings that claimed the lives of over 90 people at a memorial for General Qasem Soleimani in Kerman, which was the deadliest terrorist attack in Iran's post-revolutionary history. And then the ISKP's attack on Moscow this week came after years and years of propaganda focused on chastising Russia and the Putin regime for their treatment of Muslims in Chechnya and elsewhere in the country, as well as its foreign interventions in Africa and the Middle East. So you're starting to see, and again, Lucas Weber has put together some great work on this subject, watching the ISKP propaganda machine more and more start to move out of Afghanistan and focus on, China, Russia, the United States, Pakistan, all of these other countries. And what we can see over the past few months is those aren't empty threats. They have the capability of carrying out attacks abroad, if you will. Now, a common thread that I've seen pop up since this attack in Moscow is some confusion about the fact that Islamic State still exists. They do. They have. They never went away. Also, who they target. I think mostly these arguments are being brought up in bad faith, but I felt like it was worth addressing just so that information is out there and to provide a resource if you come across something like this. I've seen a lot of, again, I think the bad faith take that Islamic State only attacks enemies of the United States, which couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, they attacked the United States and have for a long time. They killed, when they were, the earlier form of AQI, Islamic State in Iraq, they were killing Americans more than just about any other group in Iraq at that time. I mean, they got a lot of American blood on their hands, to say the least. But broadly speaking, Islamic State, they attack everybody. Again, there's no real friends of this group. Even Al-Qaeda at this point has begun to separate themselves, saying, that ideology, the actions, the operations that IS is carrying out, a little too much for us. So Al-Qaeda, Taliban, backing out. Islamic State won't even refer to Hamas by name. That's how little they think of another Sunni organization. All right, so no friends with Islamic State. Aaron Zella did a great job of documenting recently on Twitter just a handful of the claimed attacks around the world. And this isn't even a comprehensive list. And a couple of these, he just rolls up under a country, doesn't list how many various attacks took place, but I'll scroll through some of these here. Not all of these are as large as Moscow, so there's not as much media surrounding them. But in recent years, Islamic State has claimed attacks in Austria, Australia, Belgium, Canada, Egypt, France, Germany, India, Israel, Jordan, Pakistan, Philippines, Saudi Arabia, Spain, Turkey, United Kingdom, Yemen, and more. This is a very active group. I think, maybe it's not getting the attention because it's not, the mass casualty event that we just saw in Moscow, and it's certainly not to the scale of 9/11, but this group is active. Islamic State is very, very active and continuing to strike targets whenever they have the opportunity. Then I wanted to shift into why Islamic State might target Russia. Again, I think there's been a lot of confusion about this and the idea that this is somehow just exclusively a United States enemy, Islamic State, that is. But Russia has been fighting Islamic State for a long time, in Syria especially. They've been taking on Islamic State and bragging about how effective they have been in killing senior leaders and militants throughout the Islamic State organization. So Russia, really since 9/11, before 9/11 to a degree, has been very much involved in this, what we've been calling the global war on terror. By being involved in that degree, and they've kind of adjusted their stance over time, but the way that they've adjusted their stance has made them more of a target for groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. I'm actually going to refer to a couple articles written here by Colin Clark that I think outline very well why Russia is considered a prime target for Islamic State. And it's notable, I did this on purpose, these are articles from 2017. So this isn't somebody a day after the Moscow attacks justifying why this kind of thing might happen. This is Colin 7 years ago talking about why Russia is being targeted by Islamic State and will continue to be a target in the future. He says Russia is fast replacing the United States as the number one enemy of Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and other Sunni jihadist groups motivated by violent and puritanical Salafist ideology. The only pushback I'd have there is maybe they were on track, but I still think, just looking at their propaganda, the U.S. is still enemy number one for Islamic State. But Russia certainly moved up that chain. There's no doubt about that. He says, in an ISIS video titled, quote, "Soon, very soon, blood will spill like an ocean," an Islamic State fighter threatens Russian leader Vladimir Putin directly, citing the country's intervention in Syria and its growing alliance with Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, Iran, and the Lebanese terrorist group Hezbollah as proof that Moscow is the chief proponent of a growing Shiite axis throughout the Middle East. That's not crazy, right? A lot of Russia's close allies in the Middle East, the major campaigns that they're waging, a lot of these militias that have been stood up in Syria, they're doing two things. They're helping Assad to stay in power, and they're targeting Islamic State and Al-Qaeda affiliated militias, Sunni groups in the region. And then in a second article, then Clark said, quote, "There are thousands of Russian citizens fighting with ISIS and another 5,000 to 7,000 Russian-speaking jihadists, making Russia the second most popular language spoken within Islamic State. This means that Sunni jihadist groups have a ready-made native force to send back home to Russia, where the militants can more easily blend in with local populations while plotting further attacks." Again, the timeline here is actually really important. 2017 was close to the peak of Islamic State, where it was the largest that it has ever been. You could debate that now with these various affiliates, but when he's talking about ISIS, Islamic State, Iraq and Syria, he's talking about that group in Iraq and Syria, right at that time, Mosul, Raqqa, kind of throughout that stretch. It was a pretty significant organization. So the 5,000 to 7,000 Russian-speaking jihadists was probably at the peak. I would expect today that number's quite a bit lower, but the fact that it is the second most popular language, according to Colin, spoken within Islamic State, it's certain that some of those guys continued, right? They didn't go from 5 to 7,000 to 0. Even if they went down into the few hundreds, it still, to his point here, opens up the possibility of some of these ready-made native forces ready to send back home to Russia to carry out operations. He said, in its quest to become more assertive geopolitically by assuming a more aggressive role abroad, Russia has made itself more vulnerable to terrorism at home. Sunni militants may see Russian actions in the Middle East and Eastern Europe and conclude that now, while Moscow is seemingly distracted, is the time to strike. Islamic State and other jihadists could be preparing to take the fight to Russia's major cities in an attempt to prove their own relevance, while seeking to make good on repeated promises to make Putin and company pay for their misadventures in Muslim lands. Again, that article was written 7 years ago, talking about how jihadi organizations want to take revenge for what Putin has done in Syria. Now you can add Africa to that. The Wagner Group, through Russia, as well as some Russian forces, are actively engaged with putting down Islamic State groups in various portions of Africa. It's not just that Putin and Russia are fighting Sunni organizations around the world. They're killing Islamic State fighters around the world. And they've been doing that more and more over the last 7 years. So over the course of those 7 years, since Colin wrote this article, Russia has become more and more of a threat. And I thought the interesting aspect here that jumped out to me was they might conclude that while Moscow is seemingly distracted, it is time to strike. If you look over the last 20 years, has there been a time where Russia is more distracted right now while they're actively fighting a major war in Europe? Maybe the time just lined up. Again, an article from 7 years ago kind of outlining why Russia is a target for Islamic State, and I think a lot of this still holds true today. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in learning more about ISKP, be sure to check out our article just published on Substack. I'll link it in the description below. This is the kind of thing we're trying to do with that platform. It's written word. So we're not trying to, break news there, if you will. I mean, there's still a lot of information yet to come out of Moscow around this attack. But we want to be a resource, something that you can point back to and learn more about these organizations and these groups like Islamic State, Khorasan province, as they kind of come and go from the news cycle. So what Adam put together is kind of an explainer, a little background on the group, where they came from, their ideology, their rifts with other organizations, and then what possible targets might look like in the future. So again, linked in the description below if interested. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.